Ellis banged on my door before sunrise, looking like a caffeine zombie possessed by bad news. I stared through the peephole at his disheveled hair and the frantic way he was checking his watch. It was 5 in the morning on a Tuesday. The only things that should be moving at 5 in the morning are automated scripts and people with serious regrets. I opened the door just wide enough to let a sliver of hallway light hit my carpet. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. Your family is planning something terrible, he said, his voice a gravelly whisper that skipped the pleasantries entirely. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. Good morning to you too, Ellis. And which part of the family? The side that thinks I'm a tech support charity, or the side that thinks my marriage was a hostile takeover? I'm not joking, Tanner, he said, stepping past me into the foyer without an invitation. He looked like he'd spent the night staring at a police scanner. Being ex-military had given him a permanent state of hypervigilance that usually served as our neighborhood's unofficial security system, but today he looked genuinely rattled. I heard Aaron on the phone in the garage last night. He didn't see me. He was talking to your father-in-law. They weren't discussing the weather or the annual yacht club gala. They were talking about liquidation and repositioning you. They used your name, Tanner, frequently. I laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that felt brittle in the quiet of the apartment. Graham Callen has been trying to reposition me since the day I proposed to Mira. Usually that just means moving my seat to the far end of the Thanksgiving table so I'm closer to the swinging kitchen door. It's his favorite hobby, right after tax avoidance. This felt different, Ellis insisted, his eyes darting toward the hallway leading to the bedroom where Mira was still asleep. He sounded like a man who had already won a game you didn't even know you were playing. Check your accounts, check the news, just be careful. He slipped back out as quickly as he'd arrived, leaving the smell of stale coffee and anxiety in his wake. I closed the door and locked it, the click echoing through the empty living room. I told myself Ellis was just being paranoid. He lived for the idea that everyone had a hidden motive, probably because in his former line of work they usually did. I walked into the kitchen, the floor cold against my bare feet, and started the espresso machine. The low hum of the grinder was the only sound in the apartment. Mira was still a shadow in the bedroom, her breathing steady and rhythmic. She had been distant lately, her photography trips becoming longer and her explanations for them becoming shorter. She'd say things like, "The light was just right in the valley," or "I needed to capture the morning mist," which sounded like the poetic fluff she knew I'd accept. I loved her, or at least I loved the version of her that didn't feel like a stranger, but lately, that version was getting harder to find. I pulled up the morning news on my tablet, expecting the usual headlines about interest rates or local traffic. Instead, the lead story on the financial segment caught my eye like a physical blow. Callen Global Holdings announces major restructuring, small tech partners to be absorbed. My heart didn't race. It slowed down, becoming a heavy, rhythmic thud. My company, a boutique software firm I'd spent 7 years building from a garage startup into a respectable player in the data security niche, was listed as one of the partners being absorbed. The report mentioned a signed intent to sell from the majority stakeholders. I wasn't a majority stakeholder. Mira was. When we got married, Graham had insisted on investing in my firm. He'd framed it as a wedding gift, a way to ensure our future. Against my better judgment and fueled by a naive desire to please my new father-in-law, I'd let him buy in. I'd given Mira a seat on the board as a gesture of trust. I thought I was building a legacy for us. Apparently, I was just building a snack for her father's conglomerate. I refreshed the page, hoping for a typo, a retraction, anything. Instead, a new notification popped up. It was a private message from Ethan, my lead developer, and someone I'd considered a friend for a decade. Sorry, T. The offer was too good to pass up. They promised us a future in the main hive. You should check your login credentials. I sprinted to my laptop in the home office. I typed in my administrator password with shaking fingers. Access denied. I tried the backup server. Access denied. I tried the emergency encryption bypass I'd hidden in the kernel years ago. Invalid user. They hadn't just sold the company. They had erased my presence from it before the sun had even fully risen. This wasn't a business move. This was an eviction from my own life. The bedroom door creaked open. Mira stood there, wrapped in a silk robe, her camera bag already slung over her shoulder. She didn't look surprised to see me staring at my screen with a look of quiet fury. She looked tired, her expression a mask of practiced neutrality that she usually reserved for difficult clients. "You're up early," she said, her voice devoid of its usual morning warmth. "I had a visitor," I said, turning the laptop screen toward her. "And a news update. Did you sign it, Mira? Did you sign over my life's work while I was sleeping next to you?" She didn't flinch. She walked to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, her movements fluid and deliberate. My father explained it to me, Tanner. Your company was plateauing. You were too close to it to see the ceiling. By folding it into Callen Global, we secure our lifestyle. We secure our future. You'll still have a role, just a different one. A role? I stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the hardwood. I've been locked out of my own servers. My friends have already jumped ship. This isn't a merger, Mira. It's a heist, and you held the bag for them. Don't be dramatic, she said, finally looking at me. There was something cold in her eyes, a reflection of her father's predatory instinct that I had spent years trying to ignore. You're an underdog, Tanner. You always have been. You like the struggle. My father is just giving you a new one. Besides, the paperwork is done. It's legal. It's final. She set the glass down and checked her phone. I have a shoot at the estate. My family is having a brunch to celebrate the announcement. You're invited, of course, if you can be professional about it. Professional? I repeated the word like it was a foreign language. You want me to sit there and eat eggs Benedict while your father discusses how he dismantled my career over mimosas? It would be the smart thing to do, she said, heading for the door. Accept the win, Tanner. It's easier that way. The door closed behind her, the lock clicking with a finality that felt like a gavel. I sat back down in the dark office. The silence of the apartment felt heavy now, pressing in on me from all sides. My mind, usually a chaotic whirlwind of code and logic, suddenly became very still. I looked at the screen, the access denied message flickering in the dim light. They thought they knew me. They thought I was the quiet, sarcastic tech guy who would grumble, accept a pity paycheck, and eventually fade into the background of their opulent lives. Graham Callen saw me as a minor inconvenience he'd finally cleared from his balance sheet. Aaron saw me as a stepping stone, Mira. Mira saw me as a project that had reached its expiration date. They were all wrong. I am a software developer. I spent my life finding vulnerabilities in systems that people thought were impenetrable. I knew how to find the one loose thread that, when pulled, would unspool the entire tapestry. Graham Callen had a very large, very expensive tapestry. I reached into the back of my desk drawer and pulled out a small, encrypted thumb drive I'd kept for a rainy day. This wasn't just a rainy day, it was a deluge. The morning news was still playing in the background, the reporter talking about the seamless transition and the bright future of the Callen Empire. I watched as images of the Callen estate flashed on the screen, the sprawling lawns, the high-security gates, the fleet of luxury cars. It was a fortress of arrogance. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. It wasn't the calm of someone who had given up. It was the calm of a hunter who had finally seen the prey emerge from the brush. They wanted to play a game of liquidation and repositioning? Fine. We would play. But I was going to rewrite the rules. I opened a fresh terminal window on my personal, disconnected laptop. My fingers hovered over the keys. I didn't need their servers to start. I had my own tools. Ellis had been right. They were planning something terrible. But what they hadn't accounted for was that I was much better at planning than they were. They had the money, the influence, and the sheer audacity of the wealthy. But I had the passwords. I had the secrets they'd whispered near my devices for years. And most importantly, I had nothing left to lose. I began to type, the clicking of the keys rhythmic and steady. The first phase wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be obvious. It would be a series of small, inexplicable inconveniences that would slowly erode their confidence. I would be the ghost in their machine, the glitch in their perfect lives. By the time I was finished, the Callen family wouldn't just regret taking my company. They would regret ever knowing my name. I looked out the window as the sun finally cleared the horizon, bathing the city in a deceptive golden warmth. The day was starting for everyone else. For the Callens, it was the beginning of a very long, very expensive descent. I grabbed my jacket and a spare set of keys. If there was a brunch at the estate, I certainly didn't want to be late. I had a few gifts to deliver, and I wanted to make sure I saw the look on Aaron's face when his world started to stutter. The underdog was through playing nice. It was time to show them exactly what happens when you try to delete the person who built the system. The Callen estate was a monument to the idea that if you have enough money, you can buy a version of reality where the sun always shines at the perfect angle. It sat behind iron gates that hummed with a low-voltage warning to anyone who lacked the proper credentials. I drove my modest sedan up the winding driveway, parked between Aaron's oversized Italian sports car and a vintage convertible that probably cost more than my entire education. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, adjusting my watch. My pulse was steady, a rhythmic ticking that matched the internal countdown I'd started the moment Mira walked out of our apartment. I stepped out into the crisp morning air. the smell of expensive fertilizer and sea salt hung heavy. On the sprawling back terrace, the family was already gathered around a table draped in white linen. From this distance, they looked like a catalog advertisement for generational wealth: crisp linens, perfectly coiffed hair, and smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Graham Callen sat at the head of the table, looking every bit the patriarch. He was holding a glass of orange juice as if it were a scepter. To his right, Lydia was adjusting a floral centerpiece with the precision of a diamond cutter. Aaron and Fiona were leaning in close, their heads huddled together in a way that usually meant someone's reputation was being dismantled. "Tanner, you made it," Graham called out as I approached. His voice was hearty, booming with the false camaraderie of a man who had just successfully pickpocketed you and was now offering to buy you a drink. "We were beginning to think you'd decided to sleep in. Given the news, a little rest would be understandable." "I'm a morning person, Graham. You know that," I said, pulling out a chair next to Mira. She didn't look at me. She was busy framing a shot of a crystal pitcher with her camera, the shutter clicking with a mechanical indifference. Besides, I wouldn't want to miss the victory lap. "That's the spirit," Aaron chimed in. He looked smugger than usual, his silk tie shimmering in the light. "No hard feelings, right? Business is a contact sport. Sometimes you're the one making the play, and sometimes you're the one on the sidelines. It's all for the greater good of the brand." "The brand," I repeated, picking up a silver fork and examining its weight. "It's impressive how quickly you all moved. It must have taken months of coordination. All those Sunday dinners where we talked about the expansion. You were actually discussing the dismantling. It's quite a feat of organizational stealth." Lydia offered a thin, practiced smile. "We only want what's best for Mira, dear. Managing a firm of that size is a heavy burden for one person. Now, you can focus on being a supportive husband while the professionals handle the technicalities." I smiled back, the expression feeling like a tight mask. "I appreciate the concern for my schedule, Lydia. It's remarkably thoughtful." As the brunch progressed, I became a silent observer. I wasn't the victim they expected, sullen, defeated, or argumentative. I was a ghost at the feast, watching the way they interacted. I noticed the way Aaron kept checking a secondary phone hidden under his napkin. I saw Fiona's eyes dart toward Mira with a flash of genuine resentment when Graham mentioned the new trust fund allocations. There was a hierarchy here, a delicate ecosystem of greed and insecurity, and I was looking for the invasive species. I excused myself to find the restroom, but instead of heading for the main house, I took a detour toward the library. My shoes were silent on the thick Persian rugs. The estate was wired with a state-of-the-art security system that I had helped Graham install 3 years ago. He thought he'd changed the administrative passwords after the restructuring began. He hadn't. He'd changed the user passwords, but the back-end service account, the one used for maintenance and remote diagnostics, was still set to the factory override I'd configured. I slipped into the mahogany-paneled room and sat at the antique desk. I didn't need much time. I pulled a small tablet from my jacket and synced it to the local Wi-Fi. Within seconds, I was inside the house's central hub. I wasn't looking for bank accounts yet. I was looking for patterns. I accessed the internal server that managed the family's private communications. A folder marked Project Chrysalis sat on the desktop of the main terminal. I opened it. It wasn't just my company they were absorbing. They were leveraging my proprietary encryption algorithms to mask a series of offshore transfers that looked suspiciously like a massive shell game. They weren't just taking my firm, they were using my work to hide their own financial irregularities. I heard footsteps in the hallway, the sharp, erratic click of high heels. I closed the tablet and stood up just as Fiona entered. She stopped, her eyes narrowing as she saw me standing by the desk. "Lost, Tanner?" she asked, her voice dripping with the condescension she'd perfected since finishing school. "The bathrooms are in the other direction. Or were you looking for something to pawn?" "Just admiring the collection, Fiona," I said, gesturing to the rows of leather-bound books. "I didn't realize your father was such a fan of Machiavelli, though I suppose it makes sense. It's the family manual, isn't it?" "You think you're so much smarter than us," she said, stepping closer. "But look at you. You're a guest in a house you'll never own, at a table where you're barely tolerated. You're lucky Mira hasn't realized she can do better." "Maybe," I said, stepping past her. "But the thing about being the smartest person in the room is that you're the only one who knows when the ceiling is starting to crack. Give my regards to the brunch crowd." I walked back to the terrace, but I didn't sit down. I caught Mira's eye. She looked uncomfortable now, her camera resting on the table. She knew I'd been gone too long. She knew I wasn't the type to just wander around a house I'd been effectively evicted from. "I should go," I announced to the table. "I have some personal matters to attend to. New beginnings and all that." Graham stood up, extending a hand that I didn't take. "We'll be in touch about your severance package, Tanner. It'll be generous. We take care of our own." "I'm sure you do, Graham. right down to the last cent. I drove away from the estate, but I didn't head home. I drove to a small, nondescript coffee shop in a part of the city where people didn't wear silk ties. I found a corner table and opened my tablet. The data I'd skimmed from the library was already being processed by a script I'd written earlier that morning. I began to see the breadcrumbs. Ethan, my former lead developer, hadn't just jumped ship for a better salary. His private messages showed a series of gambling debts that had been quietly wiped clean by a subsidiary of Callen Global 2 weeks ago. Sophie Lane, our head of PR and a woman Mira considered a sister, had been promised a luxury apartment in the city in exchange for leaking our client list to the press to drive down our valuation before the buyout. It was a coordinated strike. They had mapped out my vulnerabilities and exploited them with surgical precision. But in their arrogance, they had left their own trails wide open. They thought I was out of the system. They didn't realize I had built a shadow system months ago, a failsafe I'd designed when I first noticed Graham's investments becoming more aggressive. I spent the afternoon watching their digital lives. I watched Aaron transfer funds to a mysterious account in the Caymans. I watched Lydia coordinate a wellness retreat that was clearly a cover for a meeting with a rival developer. And I watched Mira. Her GPS data showed she wasn't at a photo shoot. She was at a law office downtown, one that specialized in pre-nuptial renegotiations. She wasn't just helping her father take my company. She was preparing the ground for her own exit. She was waiting for the right moment to leave me with nothing, not even the memories of a marriage I thought was real. The betrayal was total. It was a complete liquidation of my identity. I felt a cold, hard knot of resolve tighten in my chest. If they wanted to treat my life like a balance sheet, then I would start balancing the books. I began by subtly altering Aaron's calendar, a few confirmed meetings with tax auditors that he wouldn't remember making. I adjusted the climate control settings for the estate's wine cellar, just enough to cause a slow, expensive degradation of Graham's prized collection without triggering an alarm. Small things. The first tremors before the earthquake. As evening approached, I received a text from Ellis. Spoke to a contact. They're moving the final assets tonight at midnight. If the transfer goes through, your firm is legally gone. You have 6 hours. I looked at the clock. It was 6 in the evening. The city was beginning to glow with artificial light, a sprawling grid of interconnected lives and secrets. To the Callens, I was a 0 on a screen, a data point to be erased. I opened a secure terminal and began to type. I didn't need to stop the transfer, I just needed to redirect it. If they wanted to play a game of repositioning, I was happy to oblige. I would move their pieces into a corner they couldn't escape from. I thought about the brunch, the laughter, the condescension, the way Mira had looked right through me. They thought the game was over. They thought they had won because they had the bigger bank accounts and the louder voices. I hit the enter key and a progress bar appeared on the screen. Infiltration complete, awaiting command. The first real strike would happen tonight. Not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, devastating errors that would make them question their own reality. I wasn't going to take their money yet. I was going to take their peace of mind. I was going to make them realize that the man they had dismissed as an underdog was the one who controlled the very air they breathed. I closed my laptop and finished my cold coffee. The hunt was officially on. The midnight hour arrived not with a chime, but with the soft, rhythmic pulsing of a server status light in the corner of my darkened home office. I sat in the ergonomic chair I'd bought with the first profits from my firm, watching the screen as the Callen family attempted to finalize their heist. Ellis had been right about the timing. At precisely 12:01 a.m., a series of automated transfers initiated, designed to sweep the remaining intellectual property of my company into the maw of Callen Global Holdings. I didn't stop the sweep. Instead, I injected a small piece of polymorphic code into the transport layer. It was a digital ghost, a script that would allow the assets to move but would append a hidden, indestructible watermark to every file. A watermark that linked the origin of the data to a series of flagged accounts I'd secretly reported to the regulatory authorities an hour earlier. They were stealing my life's work, but they were also unknowingly swallowing a tracking device that would eventually lead the auditors straight to Graham's private vault. The next morning, I was remarkably well rested. There is a certain clarity that comes with total betrayal. The noise of trying to save a failing relationship or please a hostile father-in-law simply evaporates, leaving only the cold, hard logic of the counter-strike. I dressed in my most unassuming attire, a gray hoodie and jeans, and headed out into the city. It was time to move from the digital realm to the physical. My first stop was a high-end parking garage downtown where Aaron kept his prized Italian sports car. He was obsessed with that machine, treating it more like a sentient deity than a vehicle. Thanks to the security bypass I'd mapped out from Graham's home network, I knew exactly which stall he occupied and how to circumvent the garage's local camera loop for a 3-minute window. I didn't do anything crude. I didn't slash tires or scratch paint. Those were the actions of an angry amateur. Instead, I opened the hood with a specialized electronic key fob I'd programmed to mimic the manufacturer's master signal. Once inside the engine bay, I located the primary electronic control unit. I didn't break it. I simply unseated the main wiring harness just enough to ensure that when the car reached a certain temperature, roughly 10 minutes into a commute, the engine would enter limp mode, capping his speed at a humiliating 15 miles per hour and locking the transmission in second gear. I also took the liberty of reconfiguring the infotainment system. Every time he pressed the brake, the radio would play a high-pitched, frantic recording of a kazoo playing a funeral march at maximum volume. By the time the garage cameras resumed their normal feed, I was 2 blocks away, sitting in a parked car with a view of the exit. 20 minutes later, I watched Aaron pull out, looking smug and wearing his signature aviators. I followed at a safe distance. Predictably, as he merged onto the main arterial road leading toward the Callen Global headquarters, the car began to shudder. The sleek $250,000 machine suddenly groaned, slowed to a crawl, and began emitting a cacophony of kazoo music that echoed off the surrounding office buildings. I watched in the rearview mirror as a line of frustrated commuters began honking at him, and Aaron frantically pushed buttons, his face turning a vibrant shade of purple as he realized he was the center of a very public, very ridiculous spectacle. Phase 1. Psychological irritation. My second target was Fiona. She was the family's social coordinator, the one who handled the optics of their various charities and galas. She was currently at an upscale salon, preparing for a luncheon where she was expected to announce a major partnership. I knew her schedule because I'd synced her cloud calendar to my watch. I parked outside the salon and pulled out my laptop. Fiona's vanity was her greatest vulnerability. She relied on a very specific, very expensive brand of automated scheduling for her social media presence. I accessed the salon's guest Wi-Fi, pathetically secured with the name of the owner's poodle, and jumped from there to Fiona's personal device, which she had left charging at the stylist's station. I didn't delete her posts, I just edited the captions. For every photo she had queued up showcasing her philanthropy, I added a subtle, sarcastic footnote about the actual cost of her outfit compared to the donation amount. I also sent a mass email to her entire contact list from her account, announcing that due to a sudden burst of humility, the afternoon luncheon was now a potluck, and guests were encouraged to bring their own Tupperware and sit on the floor to better understand the plight of the underprivileged. I caught a glimpse of her through the salon window as she checked her phone. The horrified expression that crossed her face was more rewarding than any financial settlement could ever be. She began frantically typing, but I'd already locked her out of the account by triggering a suspicious activity flag that required a physical identity verification at a bank branch 3 miles away. By noon, the Callen family group chat, which I was still silently monitoring, was a disaster zone of confusion and accusations. Graham was demanding to know why the office climate control was stuck at 85 degrees. Aaron was screaming about his car being possessed by a musical demon. Fiona was in tears over her ruined social standing. Mira was the only one who remained silent in the chat. I decided to pay her a visit, not at the estate, but at her private studio downtown. I wanted to see if the cold neutrality she'd displayed at brunch was a facade, or if she was truly as invested in my downfall as her father was. I let myself in using my key. The studio was filled with the scent of developer chemicals and expensive paper. Mira was standing over a light table, looking at negatives. She didn't look up when I entered. Aaron's car had a nervous breakdown, she said quietly. And Fiona is currently hiding in a bathroom because she thinks she's been hacked by a socialist collective. I assume I should be looking at you for an explanation. I'm just a guy who lost his job, Mira, I said, leaning against the doorframe. Maybe the universe is just balancing the scales. Or maybe your family's luck is finally running out. She turned to face me. There was no anger in her expression, only a profound, weary sadness that caught me off guard. My father doesn't lose, Tanner. He's already seen the ripples you're making. He's hired a private investigator, a man named Vane. He doesn't look for digital footprints. He looks for people. You should stop now, while you still have a chance to walk away with your dignity. My dignity was in that company, Mira. You helped him take it. I helped him because he was going to destroy you if I didn't, she snapped, her voice finally cracking. He wanted to tie you up in litigation for a decade. He wanted to make sure you never worked in tech again. I convinced him to just buy the firm. I thought it was the lesser of two evils. I looked at her, searching for the lie. It was a clever story, the tragic wife playing both sides to save her husband. But I'd seen the law office visit. I'd seen the prenuptial papers. That's a touching narrative, I said. But it doesn't explain why you're renegotiating our marriage contract to ensure I get 0% of the assets we built together. It doesn't explain why you're preparing for a life without me while I'm still standing in the room. The color drained from her face. How did you... I'm a developer, remember? I see the things people try to hide in the margins. You weren't protecting me, Mira. You were protecting your inheritance. You didn't want my plateauing company to devalue the Callen name. I walked toward the door, my heart feeling like a cold stone in my chest. Tell your father that I'm not just making ripples, I'm the tide, and tell Vane I'll be looking for him. I left before she could respond. The air outside felt sharper, the stakes higher. I had confirmed what I'd feared. There was no one left on the inside. I was truly alone in this. As I walked toward my car, I noticed a black SUV parked across the street. The driver didn't turn away when I looked. He just sat there, a silhouette behind tinted glass, watching me with a stillness that felt predatory. Vane. Graham hadn't wasted any time. I got into my car and started the engine. I didn't feel afraid. If anything, the presence of a physical adversary made the situation feel more real, more manageable. A computer system has rules, a person has instincts, and instincts can be manipulated. I led the SUV on a winding path through the city, testing his patience. He was good. He stayed 2 cars back, never overcommitting, using the flow of traffic to mask his presence. But he didn't know the city like I did. He didn't know the dead zones where the GPS signal dropped out, or the narrow alleys where a sedan could pass, but an SUV would struggle. I ducked into a multi-level parking structure near the waterfront. I drove up to the 4th floor, then immediately took the service ramp back down to the 2nd. I parked in a dark corner, turned off the lights, and waited. A minute later, the black SUV cruised past, heading toward the upper levels. I watched the red glow of its taillights disappear around the ramp. I pulled out my phone and sent a quick command to the estate's security hub. If Graham wanted to use a private investigator, I would give that investigator something to find. I created a fake digital trail, a series of secret encrypted files stored on a server located in a basement office I'd rented under a pseudonym. I made sure the trail was just difficult enough to find that a professional like Vane would feel a sense of accomplishment when he cracked it. Inside that secret folder was a collection of documents that appeared to show I was planning to leak the Callen family's tax records to the international press. It was a decoy, a massive glowing target for them to focus on while I worked on the real endgame. I looked at the clock. The afternoon was fading. The first strikes had been successful, but they were just the beginning. The family was rattled, their sense of security shaken, and their attention was now fixed exactly where I wanted it, on a phantom threat. I drove out of the garage, leaving Vane to search the empty upper floors. I had a meeting to arrange with Ethan. He was the weakest link in the chain, the man with the gambling debts and the guilty conscience. It was time to see how much pressure a friend could stand before he started to break. The sun was setting, casting long, jagged shadows over the city. The calm before the storm was officially over. I could feel the momentum shifting. They thought they had neutralized me by taking my company and my marriage, but all they had really done was remove the last things holding me back. I was no longer the underdog. I was the architect of their ruin. The neon sign above the diner flickered with a rhythmic hum that matched the tapping of my fingers against the laminate tabletop. It was nearly 11 at night, and the rain had turned the city into a blurred reflection of itself. I chose this place because it was public enough to prevent a scene, but isolated enough that Ethan couldn't disappear into a crowd. I watched the door. My laptop opened to a screen that looked like a simple spreadsheet, but was actually a live feed of the Callen family's panicked internal communications. When Ethan finally walked in, he looked like a man who hadn't slept since the merger was announced. His coat was damp, his eyes were bloodshot, and he kept glancing over his shoulder. He saw me and froze, his hand hovering near the door handle as if contemplating a sprint back into the rain. "Sit down, Ethan," I said, my voice low and steady. "The coffee is terrible, but the conversation is going to be very interesting." He slid into the booth opposite me, his movements jerky. "Tanner, look, I didn't have a choice. Graham, he knew about the Atlantic City trips. He bought the markers from the guys I owed. He told me if I didn't hand over the administrative bypass codes, he'd let the collectors come for me. I'm sorry, man. I really am." Sorry is a sentiment for people who spill a drink, not for people who sell out a decade of friendship to cover a bad hand at the poker table, I said, turning the laptop screen toward him. It showed a detailed ledger of his debts, highlighted in a sickly green. "But the interesting part isn't what you did for Graham. It's what you did for me without realizing it." Ethan squinted at the screen. "What are you talking about?" "I knew you were struggling months ago, Ethan. I saw the way you were skimming the payroll scripts. So, I updated the bypass codes you gave Graham, the ones they used to absorb the company. They didn't just transfer the assets. They triggered a hidden protocol I call the parasite. Every minute those servers stay linked to Callen Global, my software is siphoning their core capital into a secure, untraceable escrow account. Ethan's face went pale. You're robbing them? Tanner, they'll put you away for the rest of your life. I'm not robbing them. I'm reclaiming my property. And technically, the transfer looks like it was initiated from your terminal, which brings us to the leverage part of our evening. You're going to give me the physical security keys to the Callen Estate's private server room, or I'm going to let the parasite finish its job using your digital signature as the primary actor. I can't, Ethan whispered. Aaron is already suspicious. He's been following me. As if on cue, a familiar black SUV pulled into the parking lot, followed closely by Aaron's repaired sports car. The kazoo music was gone, but the fury on Aaron's face, visible through the windshield under the streetlights, was unmistakable. Fiona was in the passenger seat, her phone held up like a weapon as she filmed the diner window. Time to go, I said, snapping my laptop shut. What about me? Ethan stammered. Decide whose side you're on, Ethan, quickly. I didn't wait for his answer. I headed for the back exit, slipping through the kitchen where a bored cook didn't even look up from a grill. I emerged into a narrow alleyway choked with trash bins and the smell of wet cardboard. I had a bike stashed 3 doors down, a matte black mountain bike that could navigate the city's veins much faster than a car could navigate its arteries. I heard the screech of tires as Aaron and Fiona circled the block. They weren't just looking for me, they were trying to corner me. I hopped on the bike and pedaled hard, turning into a maze of one-way streets and pedestrian walkways. Behind me, I could hear the roar of Aaron's engine. He was driving like a man with nothing to lose, jumping curbs and ignoring traffic signals. The chase moved toward the waterfront. The rain intensified, slicking the cobblestones. I ducked into a construction site, weaving between stacks of rebar and concrete mixers. The SUV, driven by Vane, tried to follow, but it was too wide for the temporary fencing. I heard the sickening crunch of metal against a steel beam as he got stuck. Aaron, however, was more persistent. He abandoned his car at the edge of the site and started chasing me on foot, Fiona trailing behind him, screaming into her phone. You're finished, Tanner, Aaron yelled, his voice echoing off the skeletons of the new high-rises. My father is going to ruin you. You think you're smart. You're just a thief. I stopped the bike at the edge of a steep drop-off that led down to the lower docks. I looked back at him. He was gasping for air, his expensive suit ruined by the mud and rain. He looked pathetic, a spoiled child whose favorite toy had been taken away. The difference between us, Aaron, is that I built my world. You just live in the one your father bought for you, I said. And right now, the rent is coming due. I pulled a small remote from my pocket and pressed a button. A block away, a series of pre-programmed digital advertisements on massive LED billboards flickered. Instead of perfume and watches, they began displaying Aaron's private text messages, the ones where he'd bragged about skimming from the family's charity gala to pay for his car's custom paint job. Aaron stopped. He looked up at the towering screens, his mouth hanging open. Fiona caught up to him, her face twisting in horror as she saw her own name mentioned in a message about an offshore account she thought was a secret. That's a public square, Aaron. Thousands of people are seeing that right now, including, I suspect, your father's legal team, I said. I didn't wait for the fallout. I rode down the service ramp and disappeared into the shadows of the docks. I had a safe house, a small, windowless office in the industrial district that I'd rented under the name of a defunct shell company. When I arrived, I was soaked and exhausted, but the adrenaline was still humming in my veins. I sat at the desk and pulled up the security feed from the estate. I saw Graham standing in the library, his face a mask of cold rage as he watched the news reports about the digital vandalism occurring across the city. He looked older, more fragile. The invincibility he'd worn like a cloak was starting to fray at the edges. Then, the door to the library opened. Mira walked in. I leaned closer to the screen. She wasn't crying. She wasn't arguing. She handed her father a folder. I zoomed in, trying to catch a glimpse of the contents. It was the pre-nuptial agreement I'd seen her with earlier, but it had been heavily annotated in red ink. She began to speak, and though the audio was muffled, I caught enough to understand the twist. She wasn't just renegotiating for her own sake. She was showing her father that I had already accessed his private cloud, the one containing the Project Chrysalis files. She was telling him that I had enough evidence to dismantle Callen Global from the inside out. She was playing the double agent, but not for me. She was using my leverage to blackmail her own father into giving her a larger share of the empire. She was the most dangerous of them all, the one who had learned his lessons too well. I felt a pang of something that might have been disappointment, but it was quickly replaced by a sharp, clinical appreciation for her strategy. She had realized that the sinking ship was a great place to negotiate for a lifeboat. Well played, Mira. I whispered to the empty room. But she didn't know about the parasite. She didn't know that the assets she was bargaining for were already being liquidated into an account she couldn't touch. She thought she was the one holding the cards, but she was just another player at a table that was about to be flipped. I turned my attention back to the terminal. The final stage was approaching. I had the family divided, their secrets exposed, and their primary investigator stuck in a construction fence. But I still needed the physical security keys. Without them, I couldn't finalize the transfer that would return my company's intellectual property to its rightful owner. A notification popped up on my phone. It was an encrypted message from Ethan. I have the keys. Meet me at the old shipyard warehouse. 1 hour. I'm done being a pawn. It felt like a trap. It probably was a trap, but it was the only move I had left. I checked my supplies, a high-frequency jammer, a portable server, and a tactical flashlight. I didn't need a weapon, I needed an exit strategy. I left the safe house and headed back into the rain. The city felt different now, less like a grid of streets and more like a circuit board waiting for the final command. The betrayal had started with a whisper in the dark, and it was going to end with a deafening silence. As I approached the shipyard, I saw the silhouettes of the massive cranes standing like silent sentinels against the gray sky. This was where the Callens kept their private fleet of shipping containers, a perfect place for a final confrontation. I could see a single light burning in the window of the warehouse office. Ethan was waiting, or someone was. I took a deep breath, the cool air filling my lungs. I was tired of being the underdog. I was tired of the sarcasm and the shadows. Tonight, the balance would be restored. Tonight, the Callen name would mean nothing, and the system I had built would finally be mine again. I stepped into the warehouse, the heavy door groaning on its hinges. The smell of oil and salt was overpowering. I moved into the center of the vast echoing space, my footsteps muffled by the dust. "Ethan," I called out. The light suddenly flared to life, blinding me. When my eyes adjusted, I wasn't looking at Ethan. I was looking at Graham Callen, standing behind a wall of security guards with Mira by his side. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Tanner," Graham said, his voice echoing through the rafters. "But you forgot the first rule of the system. You can't overwrite the administrator." I smiled, though they couldn't see it from that distance. I didn't forget Graham. I just realized that the administrator is a position, not a person, and positions can be filled by anyone with the right credentials. I reached into my pocket and gripped the remote. The final stage was ready. I just had to wait for them to make the first move. The warehouse air was thick with the scent of stagnant seawater and industrial grease, a stark contrast to the climate-controlled arrogance of the Callen estate. Graham stood centered in the floodlights, flanked by 2 men whose suits were built for durability rather than fashion. Mira stood a half step behind him, her expression unreadable, though she held the folder I'd seen earlier like a shield. "You've caused quite a mess, Tanner," Graham said, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls. "The billboards, the cars, the social media stunts, it's colorful, it's clever. It's also entirely irrelevant. You're playing with the lights while I own the power grid." I took a few steps forward, stopping just outside the primary circle of light. I kept my hands visible but relaxed. "You've always confused owning the grid with understanding how the electricity flows, Graham. You think because you bought the company, you bought the mind that built it. But you can't buy a vision, and you certainly can't buy loyalty when your currency is fear." "Loyalty?" Graham laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Ask your friend Ethan about loyalty. He's currently in the back of a sedan being explained the finer points of non-disclosure agreements. He gave up your encryption keys for a fraction of what he owed. Everyone has a price, Tanner. Your mistake was thinking yours was too high to be met." I looked at Mira. She wouldn't meet my eyes. She was staring at a point somewhere over my left shoulder, her jaw set in a hard line. "And what about you, Mira?" I asked. "What was your price? A seat at the head of the table? Or just the satisfaction of seeing the underdog finally put in his place?" "I'm protecting what remains," she said, her voice thin but steady. "You've turned this into a war, Tanner. My father is prepared to use every resource to ensure you are erased from the industry. I'm simply making sure that the family brand survives your volatility." "The family brand," I repeated. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone, tapping the screen twice. "You mean the brand that currently has 3 federal audits pending because of the Project Chrysalis files you so graciously consolidated for me?" Graham's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed. "Those files are on a closed loop, Tanner. You can't broadcast them from here. This building is shielded. Your little remote won't do anything but light up." "You're right," I said. "I can't broadcast out, but I don't have to. I already did that 3 hours ago. What I'm holding now isn't a transmitter, it's a synchronizer." I turned the screen toward them. It wasn't a social media feed or a folder of documents. It was a live countdown, ticking down from 60 seconds. In 1 minute, I said, the parasite protocol reaches its final stage. You thought I was siphoning money into an escrow account. That was the decoy. What the protocol is actually doing is deauthorizing every single digital certificate associated with Callen Global Holdings. Your building security, your encrypted communications, your banking access, even the smart locks on your front door, they all rely on a master root certificate that my company provided. Graham finally looked rattled. He turned to one of the security men. Check the main terminal, now. The man pulled out a tablet and began frantically swiping. Sir, I can't get in. It says the root authority has been revoked. I'm seeing invalid credential on every node. I'm the root authority, Graham, I said, my voice dropping an octave. I didn't sell you the keys to the kingdom. I sold you a lease, and I've just decided to terminate it for breach of contract. The countdown reached 30 seconds. Stop it, Graham hissed, taking a step toward me. The guards mirrored his movement, their presence suddenly much more threatening. I'll give you back the firm. I'll double the buyout. Just stop the script. It's not about the firm anymore, I said. It's about the truth. You spent your life building a fortress of lies, and you invited me in to install the locks. You should have checked the back door. I looked at Mira. You wanted to negotiate for a larger share, didn't you? You showed him my work to prove your value, but you didn't realize that by showing him, you were exposing the very flaws I needed to exploit. You were my best asset, Mira. You just didn't know it. The look of realization that crossed her face was better than any financial win. She had been played by the man she thought she was outmaneuvering. She wasn't the double agent. She was the delivery system. The countdown hit 0. The warehouse didn't explode. There was no dramatic sound. Instead, the lights simply flickered and stayed on, but every device in the room emitted a synchronized, high-pitched chirp. Graham's tablet went dark. The security guards' radios hissed with static. Across the city, I knew what was happening. The Callen Global headquarters would be in total lockdown, the elevators would be frozen, the accounts would be frozen. The entire empire had just been put into a digital coma. You've ruined us, Graham whispered. The light had gone out of his eyes, replaced by a hollow, haunting vacancy. No, I said. I've just returned you to the baseline. You still have your houses and your cars, assuming you can find the physical keys to the doors. But the power you used to hurt people? That's gone. You're just a man with a lot of expensive furniture now. I began to walk toward the exit. The guards hesitated, looking to Graham for a command, but the older man was staring at his useless tablet like it was a foreign object. He was a creature of the system, and without it, he was nothing. I stopped at the heavy steel door and looked back one last time. Mira was standing by her father, her hand on his arm, but she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at me, and for the first time in years, I saw the person I had married. She looked small, she looked terrified, and she looked entirely alone. Tanner, she called out, where are you going? You can't just leave us like this. I'm going to go have a cup of coffee, Mira, and then I'm going to start a new company, one without partners, and certainly one without family. I stepped out into the rain. The cool water felt like a cleansing ritual. I walked toward my car, the city lights reflecting off the puddles in a kaleidoscope of color. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Ellis. The fallout is all over the wires. The board is already voting to remove Graham. You did it, T. It's over. But it wasn't quite over. I had one more move to make, the final piece of the puzzle that would ensure they could never rebuild the fortress. I drove back toward the industrial district, but instead of going to my safe house, I pulled over near a public library that was open late. I went inside and used a terminal to send one final email. It wasn't to the press or the auditors. It was to the Callen family's private foundation. I had set up a permanent, irreversible trust with the funds siphoned by the parasite. It wasn't going to me. It was going to a dozens of small, struggling tech startups that Graham had crushed over the years. It was a redistribution of the air he'd sucked out of the room. I walked back out to the car, feeling a lightness I hadn't known in a long time. The weight of the betrayal had been heavy, but the act of shedding it was transformative. I wasn't the underdog anymore. I was the person who had survived the collapse and walked away with my soul intact. As I drove, I passed the Callen estate one last time. The gates were closed, the lights were off, and the massive stone pillars looked like ancient ruins in the moonlight. There was no one in the driveway. The fleet of cars was gone, likely seized or disabled. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel the need to gloat. I just felt a profound sense of closure. The system had been balanced. The logic was sound. I reached the waterfront and parked. I stood by the railing, watching the dark water of the harbor churn beneath the docks. The rain had stopped, and the sky was beginning to turn a pale, bruised purple in the east. Tomorrow there would be headlines, there would be lawsuits and investigations and 1,000 questions that I would never answer. But tonight, there was only the sound of the tide and the quiet hum of a world that was finally, truly mine. I took my wedding ring off my finger. It was a heavy piece of gold, expensive and polished. I looked at it for a moment, remembering the day we'd bought it, the hope we'd shared, and the slow, agonizing way that hope had been dismantled. I didn't throw it. I simply set it on the railing and walked away. The game was finished. The revenge was complete. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't worried about the next move. The morning sun rose over the city with an indifferent clarity, casting long, sharp shadows across the pavement. I sat on a public bench overlooking the harbor, a cardboard cup of black coffee warming my palms. The air was crisp, scrubbed clean by the previous night's storm. On the screen of my tablet, the digital wreckage of the Callen Empire was being picked over by the vultures of the financial press. The headlines were a frantic blur of words like unprecedented, systemic failure, and total collapse. To the world, it was a mystery. To me, it was just a series of commands reaching their logical conclusion. I watched a news segment showing a live feed of the Callen Global headquarters. The glass tower, once a symbol of Graham's unassailable reach, looked like a hollow shell. Employees were gathered on the sidewalk, their faces etched with the confusion of people who had arrived for work only to find their keycards useless and their workstations unresponsive. The parasite hadn't just taken the money, it had dissolved the digital glue that held the organization together. Without its proprietary algorithms, the firm was just a collection of desks and expensive views. A shadow fell over me, and I didn't need to look up to know who it was. The scent of expensive, slightly charred tobacco preceded him. Ellis sat down on the other end of the bench, his posture more relaxed than I had ever seen it. He wasn't scanning the perimeter or checking his watch. He just leaned back and looked at the water. I heard Aaron tried to explain the kazoo music to the authorities this morning, Ellis said, his voice a low rumble. They didn't find it as funny as I did. He's currently being questioned about the offshore accounts your billboards mentioned. It turns out when you broadcast a man's secrets on a 50-foot LED screen, people tend to take notice. I'm sure he'll find a way to blame the speakers, I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. How is Graham? He's at the estate, or he's trying to be. The smart locks on the perimeter gates are malfunctioning, and since the master server is down, he's currently sitting in his car in the driveway, waiting for a locksmith who can't get through the electronic security barriers. It's a very expensive cage, Tanner. He looks diminished, like a man who just realized his shadow was longer than he was. And Mira? Ellis paused, his eyes following a seagull as it banked over the pier. She's with him, but she's not talking to him. My contact says she's already been in touch with a separate legal team. She's trying to distance herself from the collapse, but the Project Chrysalis files link her signature to too many of the shell companies. She's not going to lose her freedom, but she's going to lose the name she fought so hard to protect. She'll be just another person in the crowd now? I nodded. There was no surge of joy at the news, only a quiet sense of architectural balance. The structure they had built on the foundation of my life had been unsound, and I had simply accelerated its inevitable lean. What about you? Ellis asked. You've got a lot of eyes on you now, even if they don't know exactly what they're looking for. Vane is still out there, and he's not the type to forget a walk through a construction site. Vane is a professional, I said. He follows the contract. Since the person who was paying him no longer has access to his bank accounts, Vane has already moved on to the next client. He's a mercenary, Ellis. Mercenaries don't work for free, and they certainly don't work for people whose credit is currently listed as fraudulent by every major institution. I stood up and walked to a nearby trash can, dropping the empty coffee cup inside. The movement felt light. For years, I had carried the weight of trying to fit into their world, adjusting my frequency to match theirs, suppressing my own instincts to avoid bruising their fragile egos. That weight was gone. I felt like a program that had finally been debugged, running at peak efficiency for the first time. I walked back to my car, a simple, reliable vehicle that hadn't been tampered with or tracked. I drove away from the harbor, heading toward the older part of the city where the buildings were made of brick and the businesses were built on handshakes rather than high-frequency trades. I had a small office there, a space I'd rented months ago under a name that didn't appear in any Callen database. Inside, the office was sparse. A desk, 2 chairs, and a workstation that was entirely offline. I sat down and opened a physical notebook. I began to sketch out the architecture for a new encryption protocol, one that was decentralized, transparent, and impossible to absorb. It was the work I should have been doing all along, before I let myself be distracted by the promise of scale and the approval of a man who measured worth in zeros. My phone buzzed. It was an unrecognized number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, I played the message. "Tanner," Mira's voice said. She sounded tired, the sharp edges of her confidence worn down to the grain. "I know you're listening. I wanted to say that you were right about the ceiling. I didn't see it until it was on top of us. My father wants to fight you. He's talking about lawsuits and recovery. But I know there's nothing left to recover. You didn't just take the company, you took the logic of it. I'm leaving for the coast this afternoon. I won't be coming back. I hope you find what you're looking for, even if it's just a way to be alone." I deleted the message. I didn't feel anger, and I didn't feel regret. She was right. I had taken the logic of their world. I had shown them that their power was an illusion maintained by the very people they looked down upon. In the afternoon, I took a walk through the local park. Families were playing on the grass, and a group of college students were arguing about a project. It was the normal, messy, uncalculated world that I had almost forgotten existed. I sat on a wooden bench and watched the sun dip toward the skyline. I thought about Ethan. He had reached out earlier, terrified of the consequences of his betrayal. I had sent him a single file, a log of his gambling debts being paid off by the Callen subsidiary. It was enough to keep him quiet, a permanent reminder that his freedom was a gift from the person he had tried to ruin. He would spend the rest of his life wondering if I would ever release the rest of the logs. That was his penance. As for the Callens, their ruin was more public. By the time evening arrived, the news reports had shifted from technical glitch to corporate scandal. The regulatory agencies were moving in, and the luxury cars I'd seen at the estate were being towed away as part of a preliminary asset freeze. Graham Callen, the man who liked to reposition people, was being repositioned by the very systems he had manipulated for decades. I looked at my hands. They were steady. No more hiding, no more sarcasm as a defense mechanism, no more playing the underdog. I was just Tanner Jossman, a developer who knew how to build things that lasted and how to dismantle things that didn't. I returned to my office as the city lights began to flicker on. I sat at my desk and looked at the empty screen of my workstation. I wasn't going to turn it on yet. I wanted to enjoy the silence a little longer. I thought about the wedding ring I'd left on the pier. By now, the tide had probably come in, and the gold was sitting at the bottom of the harbor, slowly being covered by the silt and the salt. It was where it belonged, part of the past, a relic of a version of myself that no longer existed. The revenge hadn't been about the money, though I had enough now to ensure I would never have to work for someone like Graham again. It hadn't been about the company, which was now a ghost. It had been about the truth. The truth that you cannot steal a man's essence just because you own his output. The truth that the most powerful thing in any system is the person who understands how it actually works. I opened my notebook to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote a single word: foundation. I began to type, the sound of the keys a rhythmic, comforting pulse in the quiet room. I wasn't building a fortress this time. I was building a bridge. I would find the other underdogs, the ones with the brilliant ideas and the empty pockets, and I would give them the tools to protect themselves. I would be the silent architect behind a new kind of system, one that couldn't be bought, sold, or liquidated. As the clock struck midnight, marking 24 hours since the collapse had begun, I finally felt the last cord snap. The connection to the Callen family, to the betrayal, to the years of suppressed resentment, it was all gone. I looked out the window at the city. It looked different now. It didn't look like a grid to be exploited or a map to be navigated. It looked like a field of possibilities. I closed my notebook and stood up. I walked to the door and switched off the light. The room was dark, but I didn't need the light to see where I was going. I knew the path. I had designed it myself. The calm was no longer a precursor to a storm. It was just the way the world felt when the noise finally stopped. I stepped out into the hallway, locked the door, and walked toward the stairs. My footsteps were firm, echoing with the confidence of a man who had finally found his own center. The story was over. The work was just beginning.